Hello, my name is Christine Sypnowich. I'm a professor of political philosophy at Queen's University, where I'm also the head of the philosophy department. I'm also engaged in my community. I'm chairperson of the Coalition of Kingston Communities, which is an umbrella organization of over 20 community groups. They have diverse interests, but what they have in common is advocating for transparency and accountability at City Hall. I'm also president of the Barriefield Village Association, which is dedicated to the conservation of the heritage of Barriefield Village, the oldest heritage district in Ontario. Lately, I've been trying to marry my work as a political philosopher with my work as a community activist and someone concerned about heritage conservation. And the fruits of that work is, among other things, this talk on the Nimby. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks. Political philosophy concerns the question of how we should live in common, in light of values like justice, freedom, and equality. Political philosophy typically talks about sovereign states, with jurisdiction over a large, usually national territory. It accordingly tends to concern itself with statist issues, such as the distribution of income and resources, the protection of minority cultures, the guarantee of rights and freedoms, or controversies over national self-determination and territory. However, the assumption that injustice, unfreedom, and inequality are relevant only insofar as they bear on the relations among citizens has been called into question by recent generations of political philosophers. And they've pushed debate in two directions. One, macro, calling for the relevance of global concerns, that is, duties of justice owed to people in far-flung corners of the world. The other is micro, inspired by the arguments of feminists, calling for attention to the personal and the injustices that can obtain in the intimate domain of family, love, and marriage. Still largely neglected, though, I think, particularly by political philosophers, is analysis of the local, cities and towns, and the political issues facing municipalities. Now, in my talk, I have 5 different topics: knowledge and interests, hypocrisy and freeriders, our backyard, the right to the city, home, place and class, public goods and public bads. I have that listed there right beside the lovely picture of William Morris's home in the 19th century, giving you an idea of an intimate domain that is very pleasant indeed. And we'll be talking about that a little more later. So how should we think about the political philosophy of cities? Most political philosophers talk about justice and put the idea in terms of how best to distribute goods or income. For example, John Rawls, pictured here, the most influential political philosopher of the last century probably, talked about distributing goods to the worst off. Thinkers like Rawls say that the political community, in order to respect individuals' freedom, should focus only on goods as the means to people's ends. They shouldn't dictate what's of value in life, and should not take a stand on the purpose or ends to which those goods, income or resources, are put. But in my work I've resisted this view. I contend that when we seek to make people equal, what we really care about is not their income or resources, but their quality of life, whether they are living well. I argue that the idea of equality should be renewed to incorporate considerations about how people live, whether they have food and shelter, access to health care, education, but more ambitiously, whether they are flourishing. Do people live in beautiful places with interesting neighbourhoods? Do they have adequate transit, green spaces, access to culture and nature? Now, I think land use policies are particularly interesting, for they're often a matter of tremendous controversy about what's best for a city and its inhabitants. And the considerations include well-being criteria, such as relations of community, social supports for vulnerable members, or potentially rather elusive aesthetic or cultural criteria about the value of a lively downtown, the conservation of a rural landscape, or the protection of a city's historic fabric. Issues at the local level, such as where to locate a halfway house, whether to close a school, or the height and massing of new construction, are often controversial. One way of capturing the controversies at stake in such cases is the appellation of NIMBY, or not in my backyard. Nimby was added to the Oxford English Dictionary quite recently to recognize a term increasingly used in academic, professional, and everyday discourse. The idea seeks to capture how local opposition to a proposed development exemplifies one or all of the following moral ills: irrational, ignorant, hypocritical, selfish, or unjust. It's thus a succinct way of discrediting the opponents of a project. Quote, "The public are considered to be wrong, and thus the response of planners should either be to educate them or simply to overrule them." In other words, if someone is calling you a NIMBY, as many local activists can attest, it's no compliment. The pejorative way of referring to the motivations of community protesters that you see in the word NIMBY figures in urban planning literature, some going so far as to characterize the task as slaying the NIMBY dragon. Political philosophers have not said much on this interesting issue of the NIMBY, but the Nimby case looks like a good example of what the Canadian political philosopher Jerry Cohen called the rich egalitarian problem. Cohen wrote a great essay called "If You're an Egalitarian, How Come You're So Rich?", where he asked about people who argue that government should do more about inequality. Do they have obligations to do what they can do on a personal level, like giving away their money? Now, we might think that inequality is best tackled by government, but that isn't an excuse, he wondered, for not doing what we can on a personal level, to reduce inequality by, for example, giving away to charity. What about the Nimby case? If someone says they believe in public policy that furthers equality, it's at least controversial that one opposes such policies because they're in your neighborhood. The accusation of NIMBYism implies that the NIMBY objects to some development or project in her vicinity simply on the grounds that it will be located in her, quote, backyard. Now, I aim to contest the idea that NIMBYism is inherently wrong. Indeed, I think that those accused of NIMBYism are often right to make the case they do, and that the term is a convenient rhetorical ploy to cast them as merely self-interested and indifferent to the interests of the wider community. Sometimes the people whose backyard it is are best placed to see the value in preserving it, not just the value to them, but its value per se. I argue that the NIMBY slur mischaracterizes the moral issues at stake, given the nature and significance of community activists' fights against unwanted development. Okay, first, the NIMBY problem, knowledge and interests. What's the alleged nature of the wrong of NIMBYism? Let's first consider the charge of ignorance or irrationality, that the public are not fully apprised of the facts and thus exaggerate or invent the risks or ills associated with a particular development. And here I have the poster from the Save KCVI campaign, where those of us who were valiantly trying to save that high school from closure constantly heard that we didn't really understand the issues at stake, and that, when we were being consulted, perhaps we were being consulted in a somewhat pro forma way, not because we actually had anything genuine to impart to the decision. Well, on this deficit model of public understanding, the public are thought to have insufficient or erroneous knowledge. So, for example, a policy that's designed to further an egalitarian goal is resisted because of misperceptions about its implications. Now, certainly, misunderstanding is always a possibility among ordinary people, especially when it comes to complex land use decisions where their interests are at stake. And citizens, ignorant about relevant research findings, influenced perhaps by distorted, scaremongering news reporting, can be guilty of overestimating the risk of a proposal. However, the charge of ignorance seems at odds with democratic municipal processes that seek public input, presumably on the view that not just that the process should take account of local interests, but also that the expression of such interests can contribute something distinctive and valuable to the making of the decision. And there are egalitarian considerations at stake here too, insofar as broad consultation is a way of treating people as equals. Moreover, the ignorance view underestimates the ability of ordinary people to acquire knowledge, be it through research or by consulting experts. This is particularly so if we subject to critical scrutiny the vested interests of the proponents of a project, who have little incentive to provide a full picture of the costs and benefits of their plans. Often engaged citizens encounter development proposals where the information provided seems to be obfuscating, incomplete, misleading, and partial. Small wonder that people distrust the sources of information provided by their local governments. Ontario's practice of heritage impact statements, for example, involves expert reports commissioned and paid for by the very proponents of the project that is feared to have adverse heritage implications. The obvious conflict of interest in such cases explains why the so-called knowledge of the experts is rightly called into question by aggrieved citizens. School closure decisions, and here I'm harkening back to the Save KCVI campaign again, they inflict sham processes on communities that seek to save historic schools when education staff have long ago decided on a school's fate. What we have in these cases is community therapy, not genuine consultation. When it comes to issues such as local heritage, for example, citizens are likely to be well informed and highly engaged. Studies indicate that given the opportunity for genuine public engagement, those who care about heritage will participate in a meaningful way. And here I have pictured the book Barriefield, 2 Centuries of Village Life, which was in fact put together by the residents of Barriefield, which is Ontario's oldest heritage conservation district. And I might just point to Bob Cardwell, one of the editors, often called Barriefield Bob, because of his enormous expertise and knowledge about heritage and the heritage of Barriefield in particular. 2. Hypocrisy and freeriders. A particularly damning accusation implied by the Nimby epithet is that opponents to the side of a development proposal are guilty of hypocrisy. They claim to support a public good, since they'd be prepared to see the proposal come to fruition in general, but they seek to block it simply because it's in their neighbourhood. A good example is the American politician Robert Kennedy, a self-declared environmentalist who favoured wind power, but who opposed a wind farm in Nantucket Sound, located near the resorts of the affluent in Martha's Vineyard, where he had property. A related, though different, morally compromised position is that of the free rider, as charmingly portrayed in my slide here of free riding on the railway. The free rider is not lying and pretending to favour a policy, as in the hypocrite. The free rider genuinely favours the policy, but is not prepared to help shoulder the costs of its realisation. I think, however, that the criticisms of hypocrisy and free riding don't apply to the so-called NIMBY. NIMBYs are not dissembling moral agents or freeloaders who are not doing their share but expect others to do so. They're not do as I say, not as I do types, for a few reasons. To take the free rider objection first, NIMBYs are not scuttling a project where all will benefit. It's the nature of NIMBY cases that what's at stake is a proposal that calls upon a minority to bear the burden of the disadvantages of a policy. They would certainly not be made better off if the policy was realized. It is, after all, inherent in the NIMBY word that a particular backyard will be adversely affected. The NIMBY is being asked to take on an inequitable burden, to be made an exception, in the sense of being asked to sacrifice their interests for the common good, without others having to make an analogous sacrifice. There is nothing hypocritical about asking that an action not be taken to the detriment of particular persons. In any case, the character of such local crusades suggests that the accusation of self-serving is better made against the instigators of the project that has the NIMBY so upset. We should not uncritically assume that any development is always for the public good. Of course, it's not surprising that, seeking investment and tax revenue, politicians and their staff are easily persuaded to go along, notwithstanding the unhappiness of those who will be most affected. But we shouldn't assume that the project is a simple matter of pitting the common good against the selfishness of the neighbourhood residents. NIMBY protest thus represents a barrier, not to societal goals, but to those of business. Caught in the middle between communities and powerful economic interests, it's much easier for municipalities to challenge the NIMBY side of the dialectic. It's certainly true that communities that rise up to protest development projects may have among them individuals who are motivated by narrow economic concerns, for example, in the property values of their homes. However, such a characterization does not capture what's at stake for most people when they defend the places they care about. NIMBY activism is not the same as an interest in, for example, getting a good price in an economic transaction. But we're talking about personal interest in these cases. That is, people having particular attachments to things that matter to them. Philosophers talk about this with the idea of agent relative reasons. That is, reasons which cannot be appreciated outside of their relation to a specific individual. That is, a promise or a personal project. These kinds of reasons indicate that NIMBY's behavior is ethical in a special way. Their motivations may be more than reasonable self-interest, as I was proposing before. This is because of the role of people's relationship to their surroundings, a relationship that points to a broader moral picture in the battles of local communities. The moral philosopher Bernard Williams defended this with the hypothetical example of a man who, if he paused to consider whether to save his wife over another drowning person, would be thought to be behaving in a morally defective way. In that situation, it's not just okay to be partial, you should be. A life without personal connections to particular persons, where one puts some relationships first, would be a deeply flawed ethical existence. Note, however, that Williams's example is not a simple matter of putting oneself before others. It means putting one's connection to a special person other than oneself before others. On a flourishing ethical view that takes a broad view of human well-being, a life marked by special concern for persons and places is better than a life without those special concerns. And of course, people's special relationship to place doesn't mean that they don't want to share it. And here I have as my example the slide here, which is a poster from the celebration of Barriefield Village on the 200th anniversary. And it was quite an affair with 2,000 people coming into the village, crafts displays, horse-drawn carriages, stonemasons doing their work, walking tours, etc. So that was a fun thing, where the heritage of a special place was shared with the wider community. 3. Our backyard, the right to the city. The arguments so far have stressed the reasonable self-interest of the NIMBY, who is not asking for special treatment, but for their legitimate interests to be taken into account. Contrary to the picture of the selfish individual pitted against the community, it is, after all, a community of people who are the protagonists. It's not my backyard, it's our backyard. Pictured here, I have the website of an organization I'm involved in, the Coalition of Kingston Communities, which seeks transparency in City Hall, and is comprised of a range of community groups, many of them concerned about heritage conservation or protecting the special features of where they live. They're seeking to protect their shared way of life and place, a common good of some kind, that's at risk in such cases as a high-rise tower that blocks the waterfront, the demolition of a neighbourhood school, a toxic dump, a highway expansion that destroys a natural habitat, a high-density housing project in a heritage district. In practically all these cases, these groups are not asking for an exception to be made in the application of city policy. Rather, they're insisting that the city follow its own rules and not be cowed by powerful economic interests, which are the ones asking for an exception to be made. Here I have, thanks to Mike Cole-Hamilton, an image from the local crusade against high-rise towers in the downtown. Far from being self-seeking egoists, NIMBYs may be more like altruists, concerned about the common good. Political engagement, as I'm sure many who are listening can confirm, entails the sacrifice of considerable time, effort, and expense. So-called NIMBYs take on the role of a watching brief to guard against future inappropriate development and sustain their activism. They are rethinkers, developing an ongoing social and organizational capacity crucial to local democracy. Those who step up to defend the valuable constituents of their locale are honoring our right to a common inheritance, what the philosopher Henri Lefebvre called the right to the city. Far from parcels of private property, then, the city is a concentration of value created by past generations and present residents. Indeed, not just past and present, but future residents are also important. We are obligated to those who come after us, for whom we must conserve the valuable features of place for them to enjoy. NIMBYs thus emerge as not simply owners of private property, but stewards of the valuable features of place which they inherit and for which they feel an obligation to pass on to future generations. It's often said of cultural heritage, for example, that once destroyed, it's gone forever. This is true of the phenomenon of place more generally, to which people have a special connection. 4. Home, place, and class. I take my lead here from William Morris, who's pictured in the slide, the famous Victorian designer who later became a socialist. In his critique of capitalism, Morris riled against what he called the ruin of the peace and loveliness of Earth's surface, how people live in places that get, as he said, plainer, grimmer, and barer. For Morris, anticipating contemporary ideas of aesthetic justice, the ideal egalitarian society promises what he said was a beautiful world to live in, where the surroundings of life are pleasant, generous, and beautiful, ornaments to nature, not disfigurements of it. So connection to place suggests a value which is incommensurable, a philosophical term for the idea that it cannot be monetarized or exchanged for another good. For if a particular place has an important role in a person's or group's identity, then it has particular features that matter and which cannot be captured in terms of a trade-off for other benefits. After all, people live in places, not sites or even backyards. Place attachment has a significant role to play in the character of protest against development. The context in which lives are lived can have a particular, irreducible, and irreplaceable moral value that shapes one's sense of self, plan of life, relationships with others, and capacity to flourish. Morris recognized this in his conservation efforts, depicted here in the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings. This is a poster from several generations ago. People share an environmental ethos. This may entail giving weight to the competing interests of other species, but also, crucially, understanding how our own well-being is tied up with the well-being of our environment and our cultural heritage. Neighborhood, locale, streetscapes, and landscapes are important aspects of an environmental aesthetics that focuses on what's called emotional geographies or therapeutic landscapes that can transform and enrich people's lives. Indigenous peoples stress how connection to land is vital to their well-being, and though their claims have some unique historical features, in particular questions of colonial violence and domination, this insight is worth heeding outside the Aboriginal context. The word Topophilia was coined by geographers to capture this sense of the importance of people's connections to special locations. And here pictured is a little boy on the main street of Barriefield Village from the last century. Thus, NIMBYs must be mindful, for example, that heritage conservation involves not just fixing up pretty old buildings, but appreciating the rich histories of those who originally lived in them, or on the land on which they were built. For example, those of working-class communities, immigrant neighbourhoods, or the inhabitations of indigenous peoples. Heritage, then, should be a broad concept, including working-class neighbourhoods, industrial buildings, immigrant communities, indigenous histories. We need to remember, when we think about the ethics of place, the contested narratives around culture, the importance of commemorating alternative stories, even those that are dark and tragic, or what we might call sites of conscience. Here I'm thinking of heritage buildings that are the places of cruelty, trauma, colonialism, or domination, such as residential schools, prisons, mental institutions, or orphanages. And pictured here is the statue of Sir John A. Macdonald, Kingston's favourite son, whose role in the residential school system renders him a controversial figure. As well, a plaque honouring Molly Brant, the Mohawk woman who also is associated with Kingston and played a pivotal role in the War of 1812 for the British forces. And at the bottom, the interior of the 19th century Kingston Penitentiary, now closed and slated for redevelopment as a condo complex. Interestingly, Indigenous peoples' struggles against development projects, for example Oka or Keystone, are often dismissed as at odds with progress, but the NIMBY slur is rarely used, probably because of a colonial assumption as to whose backyard the land in question is. This is nicely illustrated in the poster depicted here on the right, used to lure Europeans to settle in Canada, so that they could affirm "it's mine" of their newly acquired property. Indeed, perhaps Indigenous land rights activists would like the first world problem of being accused of being NIMBYs, since at least it assumes they have title to the backyard in question. Of course, some places and their inhabitants are particularly privileged. Often, built heritage has persisted because the wealthy have overlooked it. And in market economies, there's a predictable cycle here. The typical pattern is that a neglected downtown neighborhood, rich in history and character, becomes attractive for bohemian residents with high cultural capital, looking to find an inexpensive but interesting place to live and work. They come in, renovate the buildings, and bring vitality to their urban space. And this in turn attracts financial capital, so that property values increase to the point that the original inhabitants can no longer afford to rent or buy there. NIMBYs are often protecting neighborhoods that have become exclusive enclaves. Of course, some NIMBYs may be privileged people who are quite happy for development projects to be relocated to vulnerable communities. Or they may be bigots who seek to exclude the wrong people from their neighborhoods. Or their resistance to the siting of a socially necessary facility may be unreasonable. However, those who rise up against a particular development proposal cannot get away with just expressing selfish preferences. They must give reasons. And the reasons they give typically make a democratic case for their voices to be heard, and for elected representatives to follow proper policy that was designed to protect the place-specific constituents of human flourishing for everyone. The local politics of NIMBYism sheds light on the myopia of contemporary political philosophy, which, as I said at the beginning of my talk, tends to focus on goods, resources, property, and income, instruments for pursuing the good, rather than constituents of the good itself. However, in contrast to this squeamishness about pronouncing what is of value, earlier thinkers were unabashedly concerned about the good life for all, convinced that how we live is ultimately what's at stake in seeking to provide equal citizenship, something that was recognized by early architects of the British welfare state, such as William Beveridge, pictured here, who put the case not in terms of salaries or income, but sources of well-being. He used the word squalor, for example, as one of the giants, as he put it, to be felled or killed or put down by the just society. And it's worth reminding ourselves of how municipal policy is all about contributing to the health and well-being of city residents. 5. Public goods and public bads. We're now in a position to reject the view that NIMBY claims are, to quote a planner in the scholarly literature, intrinsically self-serving, function to perpetuate forms of social injustice, explicitly indifferent to the public good. Indeed, the NIMBY, far from being an opponent of the public good, may in fact be fighting to defend it. What is the public good? There are a lot of ways of understanding the idea. The public good can mean a shared understanding of value, such as the value of green space, something which a society agrees is valuable for everyone. This is related to a second understanding, where the public good refers to those goods that a society provides publicly, such as health care or, again, green space. The public good can also refer to public access. So, a third sense, the good is public when it's accessible to all, for example, by free admission to parks or museums. And fourth, a good is public in virtue of it being non-excludable and not a possible object of distribution at all, such as clean air. On my human flourishing conception, the value of the public good lies in its contribution to individual well-being, something shared by all four ideas of the public good. What about public bads? I think the much maligned NIMBY is often warding off public bads. When they protest against a project in their neighborhood, they're often pointing to its negative impact, whatever its location. thus prompting the term Noby, N-O-A-B-Y, not in anybody's backyard. Sometimes, perhaps, the NIMBY objection underscores how the project shouldn't occur in this or that backyard, because it shouldn't occur in any such backyards. A second respect in which the NIMBY cause may help to ward off public bads and serve the public good lies in the objective value of the place in question. That is, the particular has universal value. Protesters are often seeking to save something that is not just good for them, but something that's good for us all. And I hope I've captured that in my drawing of Barriefield Village in the slide here. Sometimes advocates for development projects take the view that it's only fair that the project go ahead and the valuable features of a place be sacrificed, because those valuable features aren't available for all. But this looks like an instance of what philosophers call leveling down. Leveling down refers to the dilemma where the idea of equality is taken strictly, dictating that all individuals have exactly the same shares. On this view, equality entails a uniform pattern in which each person possesses as much as every other person. If we can't improve the position of the worst off, equality dictates that we should worsen the situation of the best off. But this looks absurd. So long as others' shares do not affect one's own, it's unclear why one should care about them. Ultimately, the rationale for strict equality looks like an aesthetic ideal of symmetry, divorced from human interests, an odd goal for politics. If equality means leveling down, the argument goes, we should abandon equality. But that seems a bit quick. Inequality and leveling down are both wrong for the same reason. People have fewer goods than they would and should otherwise have. Goods are good, so to speak. They provide well-being, and that is why we want more of them. That's why we perceive both the wrongness of an unequal distribution of goods and the wrongness of removing goods from some people simply because they cannot be equally shared. This is especially so when it comes to the good of place, which cannot be redistributed in the same way many other goods can. But also, if we go back to our idea of public goods in the context of place, once we see the value of a particular place, we can also see that place benefits people who don't live there. After all, heritage districts and green spaces, for example, may be especially valued by those who live in or near them, but they're also constituents of the flourishing of the wider community, indeed in some cases even the world. This is evident in, for example, UNESCO World Heritage Sites, such as our own Fort Henry and the Rideau Canal System in Kingston, which are an amenity for the local population, but also valuable for humanity. Such places are accordingly called global public goods, and that's among the issues that I discuss in my book, Equality Renewed, pictured here. We might value a place very far from where we live, which we might never visit. The lives of all of us are enriched by the existence, for example, of Venice. Venice is a good example of a place that the world agrees should be preserved, not just for the well-being of Venetians, but as a heritage asset for us all. In conclusion, I've argued that NIMBYism is a position in local politics that is unfairly castigated as essentially selfish and unjust. First, I've argued it's wrong to dismiss local residents as ignorant or mistaken. Second, the charges of hypocrisy and free riding can be countered, given the reasonable self-interests involved. Third, the collectivist and democratic character of neighborhood protests suggests that self-interest in the usual sense does not adequately describe the NIMBY view, when communities of people fight against unfavourable development. Fourth, I've pointed to the ethics of place inherent in NIMBYism that conveys the role of flourishing for equality, a much richer understanding of the values at stake than is commonly supposed by NIMBY detractors. And finally, I've elaborated on the public good dimension of NIMBYism, noting the example of global public goods such as World Heritage Sites. Of course, some NIMBY crusades are simply misguided or downright wrong, or they may be valid but defeated by other more important considerations. Which NIMBYs ought to prevail and which should not depends on the case. But William Morris's socialist ideal of an earthly paradise, which I think is nicely captured in this final slide, reminds us of the importance of place for human well-being and the struggle for equality. People who defend their so-called backyards may be working towards a better community and a better world for all of us. Rather than denigrating the efforts of local activists as mere NIMBYs, often we should be saluting them when they fight to protect the neighbourhoods they care about. Thanks very much.